ceiling, whatever you picked. But they showed that this conceptual error leads to standard tax being suboptimal. They calculate a corrected path, and the model that they calibrate then to US data shows that the optimal tax might be, in total terms of the expense, a tenth as costly as previously thought. Now, in fact, that ought to be quite good news, because if this is correct, then it means there ought to be enormous, potentially, common ground for the people who are most concerned with climate and the people who are most concerned with economic development. That maybe we don't have to all be disagreeing on these things. There may be a great deal of common ground. And I'm going to skip the technical details of this, but we spent about 3 or 4 lecture days in the math econ course going through this stuff, and it made a good deal of sense, at least to me. One of the things that they point out is that this approach gives you more economic growth that will protect people from climate damages. And it provides more resilience and more time to adopt better technology to try to take care of these problems, and eventually, get solar and such things working. In my opinion, someday it's very likely that the vast majority of our energy is going to be solar energy, because once we know how to really handle it, it's in essence free for the taking. All you can use. Other kinds of possibilities that have been proposed beyond this exist, and I won't talk about those, but nuclear, carbon capture and removal, other things that I've not imagined. But opening up the market to entrepreneurship and innovation, rather than shutting it down, would be the solution to solving climate and other kinds of problems, and developing and building a flourishing type 1 civilization. That's my very long-winded answer to what we were set up for.
You probably understand that James Hansen makes the same argument. The carbon tax is the solution. James Hansen is probably the most well-known scientist in the United States.
Other questions? Yvonne.
Just very quickly, I think when you were talking about the IPCC report from last year, I think you mentioned, if I caught it correctly, that that's the one where it says that we have 12 years to the tipping point, right?
Yes.
Did you say that?
Yes.
Actually, that's not true. So that's been AOC's thing, right? And she's been claiming that we've got, she's totally misstating it. It's like 12 years till the world ends, right? But, supposedly it's the tipping point. The Associated Press did a fact check on this, and that's certainly no right-wing organization, right? Let me get that up here. This, and it just disappeared. That is really annoying. Hang on. I will have it back in a jiffy. Okay, this was just, here we go. So the Associated Press fact check was from, I don't have the date, about a month ago. And it said that it actually talked to the people behind the report. And they said that is misunderstood. That so in fact, here I'll read you the quote. James Skia, co-chairman of the report and professor of sustainable energy at Imperial College London, told the Associated Press, the panel did not say we have 12 years left to save the world. He says the hotter it gets, the worse it gets, but there is no cliff edge. This has been a persistent source of confusion, agreed Christy L. Eby, director of the Center for Health and the Global Environment at the University of Washington, Seattle. The report never said we only have 12 years left. So anyway, you can look this up yourselves, but there is no tipping point.
Okay.
And it's really, I'm not arguing with you. I think it's important that people know there's no tipping point. So, and even the people that are making these reports are actually not claiming that there is a tipping point.
One thing I'll say about that, I think that they're, all right, well maybe I'm stand corrected, but I think what they're actually saying is that there's is something like 12 years for the 1.5 ceiling, which is a little bit different. But
there was 2030 was the goal. I mean, that was kind of horizon where they were looking, and they wanted to
There's
hit
not-
that ceiling in 2030.
The report
but
does
yeah.
not say that the world comes to an end in 12 years,
Right.
if that's what you're suggesting.
Yeah.
That's not what I meant to say.
But not even that it's irreversible after that, you know, so even that they're not saying.
Yeah, I would like to respond to your comment.
I was hoping you
The
would.
purpose of that report was when the IPCC had the Paris Agreement, they had specified a range of limiting the temperature increase between 1.5 and 2. And so then at that point, they started that process of developing that report, and the report was asked to report on the differences in the impacts of a 1.5 degree limit versus a 2.5 degree limit. That was the charge given that report writing committee. And so they said, all right, let's see what the differences would be. And they also pointed out, well, what would we have to do to our emissions to keep the temperature increase no larger than 1.5 degrees? And they have a graph in there in the first few pages of the executive summary, which is like one of the essential graphs of the whole report. And it basically says, well, to keep it at 1.5 degrees, we have to reduce to basically zero our CO2 emissions sometime between 2040 and 2050, 2055, I think, depending on what we do to other things that influence the temperature besides CO2 emissions. Okay, that's what the report said. Now, there are many tipping points in the climate, and they have been well studied. They are, when we cross those tipping points, the heating of the planet will accelerate. And it's really kind of critical that some of them don't get crossed. Some of them are in the process of getting crossed right now, and there's some that are a little higher up in temperature. But if we cross those, the problem is way worse than it is. So those tipping points are very real. Okay, the tipping points in the climate are very real.
But then you need to take it up with the authors of the report, because they are denying that. And their quotes are right there.
No, they did not say the world's going to come to an end in 12 years.
No, they're actually
just told
denying
you
that
what
there
they
are
said.
tipping points. In
They
fact,
just
if you
told
go,
well,
hang
there
on,
are
Ken,
tipping points in
hang
the
on.
climate.
Can you, let me just finish. If you actually look at the entire article, they address the issue of tipping points. And they said, there are several of them that say there are no tipping points. It gets more difficult. These are the people behind the report.
Yeah, what they said and what I deduced from the quote you read.
I didn't, that's just the beginning of the quote. They said the world is not coming to an end in 12 years.
There's a huge mountain of work that's been done on tipping points. There's a huge mountain of work. There's no doubt that they exist. Okay? One of them, which we're crossing right now, is the melting of the Arctic sea ice. That is real. And when the Arctic sea ice is gone, then the planet's going to heat faster because the sea ice reflects a lot of light back into space. Right now, if you look at the Arctic sea ice extent, go look at the Arctic sea ice extent, it's dramatically low, and in the Bering Sea, the last 2 years, it's been vastly less than in all the previous years it's been measured, in the last 2 years, in 2018 and in 2019. It's only going to get worse as we continue to heat the planet. That is a real tipping point. There are other tipping points. Okay? This one happens to be one of the earliest. And we have to avoid those, or it's just going to accelerate. These guys in the report said there's nothing, we didn't say the end of the world's happening in 2030. No, it's just getting worse and get worse and get worse and worse. That's why this problem has got to be solved. And you guys are the ones who are going to solve it. Because those old guys aren't going to be around to do it. You guys are going to have to solve it. So you've got to educate yourself and you've got to act.
Can I suggest we not be so quick to leave the world? I think he was looking at me when he said something about the old guys too. Maybe go ahead.
What you kind of alluded to it with
What?
you kind of
Sorry.
you kind of alluded to it with China when you were saying some examples, but like what kind of impact if this, like you said, if this theoretically happened, what kind of impact do we have on like a worldwide scale? Like if
what?
the Green New Deal happened, if all these scenarios
So-
went that way, what kind of world impact would just us changing our ways have worldwide?
Relatively little. If I might, suggest that, well, first, the bulk of the growth in greenhouse gas emissions is going to come from the developing world, not from the United States. Over the last few years, the United States greenhouse gas emissions have fallen in terms of electricity production, something that's unprecedented. I think that there's a number of reasons for it. Part of it comes from conversion from coal moving into natural gas. The Chinese, while they have claimed, Chinese government has claimed that it's going to get on board with climate reductions, has actually been accelerating the building of coal-fired plants, both in China and in other developing countries. So if you want to tackle this kind of problem, it's not going to be done in the United States and Europe. When I talk about these kinds of things, I make conditional predictions. I don't want to say what is going to happen, something like that. I say that if something happens, then something. If the United States were to drastically cut back its, implement something like the Green New Deal, this would be taken advantage of by countries such as China, who are frankly geopolitical rivals and see this, the Chinese and the Russians see the world in these kinds of terms. This gets out of talking about climate socialism, it gets out of talking about climate. But I think that is the way that some of these other countries see things. And if the West weakens, they understand that they can get world domination. And I think that's how President Xi sees it. I don't think they have any real intention of worrying about a problem like climate when they're talking about their own power. How do you bring them along in this? It's very difficult. They don't have an answer to that. I don't know if I'm a little bit, I don't know, I can talk about it a little bit. I can just say that one of the things that they have proposed are various kinds of border taxes that would be imposed to try to induce other countries to start putting in similar kinds of greenhouse carbon taxes. And whether that actually works or not, or whether it just simply is another tariff that reduces trade, good guess. It's one reason why I kind of like the approach that is suggested here, because if this works, it's much less draconian. If the costs are really less, then it's much easier to get someone like China involved in something like this. Chinese do have a real serious problem that they know, that they understand, with air pollution, simply from the standpoint of public health. I think that's a bigger concern to them. If any of you have been to China and spent any time in Chinese air pollution, you understand why that would be. So maybe there are ways of getting involved. Other questions? This is, I should mention, it's a CLO meeting as well as ACS, so it's quite fine for everybody to start debating with each other. Yes.
I was curious, what do you think about the potential of
Credit.
what do you think about the potential of a carbon credit system
Credit system?
in which people are given a certain amount of carbon they're allowed to emit and then they're allowed to sell?
So carbon credit system instead of a carbon tax. In principle, the same kinds of things can be done. As a carbon tax, it's also much more complicated to set up and more likely to be manipulated. There was a proposal in the United States, we had a proposal for a carbon trading system, and I think that it was, without being able to make this case, I think it was being set up by Goldman Sachs and Al Gore and others, and I think they had ideas of making a great deal off of it. I think a carbon tax is much less manipulable. I guess when I mentioned this carbon tax idea, they don't even call it, I think it's sleight of hand, but they don't call it a carbon tax. They call it a carbon dividend plan. And the notion is that everything would be rebated. They have the carbon tax, and to make people buy into it and not oppose it, it would be rebated back as a flat dividend to every American citizen. So you don't feel like you're taking it in the wallet from this. That's the idea. So.
In the interest of time, we can have one more question.
Although Douglas MacArthur told us we can hang on to this room until security kicks us out. Good question.
You mentioned that the metric we have to use is not a profit and not a metric of profit and loss, but that we have to measure it in the loss of human lives. Do you have any idea of what the estimates of the death toll would be if we were
No.
to
No,
Green New Deal?
if you shut down, this is my point with this. If you shut down, if this were implemented, you shut down agriculture, you shut down transportation, you shut down electricity, what do you think is going to happen? What is going to happen in winter in the Northwest or in the Midwest? People are not going to survive that sort of thing. How are you expecting to move food from the production area? Food, how do you expect to grow food, and how do you expect it to be transferred to the places where it's needed? That's all there is to it.
What about in terms of like GDP per capita?
The thing is such an odd scenario that it's hard to, I thought about it might be interesting to sit down and try and do something like this, but it's all a wild guess. It won't work, is the bottom line of this. Similarly, some people say, oh, it's going to cost, this would cost $60 trillion. No, it would cost $100 trillion. No, it costs, what's the difference between $60 trillion and $100 trillion? It's more than the whole U.S. economy. What are you talking about? How can you talk about cost centers?
Is there another question back there?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Although people don't really like nuclear energy, do you think that could be part of the solution, especially like if the government decides to subsidize that instead of just the carbon tax?
Yes. Nuclear energy works. I've lived in France a little bit, and they're mostly nuclear. There are reasons why nuclear might be, I also live very close to Chernobyl, and nuclear energy has something of a bad reputation there, in Kiev. Although our electricity in Kiev is coming from Chernobyl, from the reactors still running. So sure, no greenhouse gas emissions from that.
Dr. Steele, what about the climate deniers, those who would just say that climate change and global warming just doesn't exist? How do they factor in?
How do they factor in? They will all be imprisoned. I say that as sort of a joke. It was something I thought about including in my talk, talking about how radical some of the ideas are for talking about radical change. But a number of people, James Hansen is one of them, has suggested that there should be climate tribunals for people who are called the deniers. I would be one of them. I worked with Heartland Institute, and that's one of the groups that would be called climate deniers, that there's no such thing as climate change, or that we engage in something along the lines of the Holocaust. And there have been calls from a number of people who have suggested, well, once we get something in place, then we should start thinking about trials for climate tribunals. I'm not going to a climate tribunal. I'll just tell you, if something like that were set up, there's no way I'm going to it. The United Nations has contemplated setting up things like this. If I were to say, and I actually believe this, that I don't think there's any such thing as climate change, well, I should have the right to say that. Simple as that. Other questions?
In addition to a carbon tax, would you think removing government subsidies of like?
Remove government subsidies. You don't have to say anything.
Yeah.
Yes. But actually, go ahead. I didn't mean
No,
to cut
that
you
was
off.
it. That answered it. I didn't even need to finish the question.
I know. I know, but I mean, Eddie, go ahead. Yes. Government subsidies for, say,
For like, I guess really like agriculture is a big one, but like just in general removing.
yeah. Yes. Yes, and you're utopian. Unfortunately, I'd like to be in that utopia. Well, it's very difficult to remove subsidies, and for obvious reasons. You've got a small number of people who benefit, and a large number of people, and the costs are spread across them. But subsidies upset these kinds of systems as well.
Would it be wishful thinking to kind of assume that changing consumer preferences based off of the like increasing images and like reality of climate change would change like the firm's incentive to be more eco-friendly or work towards reducing fuel emissions?
Actually, I do want to say a couple of things about that. Maybe it's a little bit, yes, I think it's, I mean, in some ways, yeah, I think that's completely unrealistic. I'll explain why. This actually gets back to something that was really, when you did when Dr. Hayes did a presentation, it was about 1.5 years ago, and this is over for the Conservation Club. And at the end of it, so if I might, I don't know if I'm not putting words in your mouth, but it was effectively that the developments in energy and market solutions were going to ultimately be enough to solve this problem. I think that's basically what your point came to. And Professor York, Dan York from biology, said something about, look, he says, I don't think that's right. He said, I think we need to understand that people just have to have a change of preferences in some sense. And he had his cell phone. And I lost my cell phone. So he's waving his cell phone around. He says, people have to understand how much energy they're using when they're doing this. Because you look at it and, you've got all these servers all over the world which are operating and you're doing things. And I argued with him right at the spot on this. I said, I carried away, said that's crazy, but there is something that's a little bit crazy about it. If I think I want to do everything I can to avoid using, if I want to use the low cost way, what's the best way to read something? Is it on paper or is it on this? Which one saves energy? Do I turn on I read at night. Do I read a book? Do I read on this? Do I read a Kindle? Do I turn on my light? Do I've got a little battery thing? Which one uses the least energy? I have no way of telling that. I can tell things through a price signal as a consumer, but I can't just say, well, I'm going to be more environmentally conscious and do the thing that seems green. One of the things that was, it's pretty critical, what IPCC and the UN do. They had a recent conference in Katowice, Poland, and they were, on the website they had set up for this, they were bragging that they were minimizing the amount of stuff that they were printing. They're putting it all on computer screens. If you wanted to read documents, they didn't want you to print them. They wanted, if you're attending the conference, you'll read it on your computer screen. Which one uses less energy? How the heck, I don't know. But this saves paper, and we know that cutting down a tree is good. I mean, come on, this is not any kind of a careful cost-benefit analysis. This is a kind of posturing when they say these sorts of things. Did you calculate it? Well, if you calculate it, you can understand it. As a consumer, I can't possibly know that. Go ahead and tell me I should be more conscious, but I don't know what to do. All right, with that, Christian is unlocking the doors.
I wanted to say one thing. I apologize to Dr. Hayes. He will probably not be happy about this. This is not an attack on you, but I did actually hear Dr. Robert Baldwin speak about 10 years ago, and he was one of the authors of the IPCC report from around that time. He's oftentimes, reported as a denier, climate change denier, and he actually, during that talk, he said, absolutely not. I believe that if you pump up all of this massive amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, it's going to affect things. But what he actually said, and I think this is a very important point, it ties into your presentation, what markets do amazingly well is entrepreneurial innovation. And we obviously, I think we have a problem. There is something going on here. This is not something that we should be blasé about. But what Baldwin pointed to is that if you think back, go back, just think to the state of science 100 years ago and how primitive it was by today's standards. Now let's think about, the fact that the state of science is actually accelerating. We are learning more and more all the time at an accelerated pace. Let's think of 100 years from now, how much we will know about all of these things. And even something like bioengineering, which seems like a dream at this point, is almost certainly going to be routine. That we're going to be able to actually engineer the globe. Global environment as a matter of course. And so his point was to make significant sacrifices now, which will prevent the prosperity that is necessary to be able to bring about that kind of scientific advance. It would be a massive mistake and would actually be harmful to the future generations. That the most important thing we can do is to try to have the greatest amount of prosperity created right now, because that is ultimately what's going to cause scientific progress which will allow us to solve this particular problem. And I'll just end with one particular example of that. In 1960s and the 1970s, peak oil theory was all the rage, that we were going to run out of oil by the year 2000. Every scientist was in agreement about this, that the world is going to come to massive harm once we run out of oil. Nobody is talking about peak oil theory anymore, because it turned out to be nonsense, because what people did not take into account is changing technology. And the changing technology took the form of fracking. Now, fracking has these other consequences that we do not like, but it did solve this other massive problem of insufficient amount of energy to get us to continued prosperity. And I have basically zero doubt that this is what's going to happen in the future too. Leave it to the entrepreneurs. So I just wanted to add that.
So the great argument for going over to the registrar tomorrow and signing up for a science major. Please do.
Any double majors.
All right, thank you all very much for coming. We're going to respect your right to leave now. However, the debate and talk is not
They
over.
didn't know they were locked in. It's standard CLO.
If you'd like to stay and discuss it more, feel free. Otherwise, let's give one more round of applause, Dr.